morning, and welcome to our third session in our study in the book of Jude as we continue to move through the verses as they're listed in the text. So I've entitled this particular session, The Grace Changers, Building a Character Profile, Part 1. And we're going to be working through Jude verses 5 to 11 as we go through the book and learn what it is that we need to be careful about in our churches and in our fellowship. So the topics we're going to discuss in this session are the characteristics of the grace changers. And we're going to look at three examples that are given in verses 5 to 11 that give us clues as to what we ought to be looking for in our relationships with fellow Christians, in our relationships in our churches, and to be on our guard for people that we encounter that exhibit these characteristics. So the three examples that are given in this text are first the Exodus. We're going to look at that, and then the angels, and we're going to make a little digression, a little sidetrack when we get to the second example here, because Jude is one of the books that introduces apocryphal literature. And so there's been some dispute as to whether these are actually angels or men. We're going to take a look at that. We're going to examine some of the internal evidence in the scriptures and some of the external evidences as well. And I think that you'll find that part really interesting, and maybe give you some food and some direction on how you can continue to chase this down in your own studies. And then finally, the third example is Sodom and Gomorrah. And what we're seeking to do over the next couple of sessions is to build a character profile of these grace changers that we've been warned about, not only in Jude, but also in 2 Peter. Okay, so just by way of review, allow me to read verses 1 to 4. These were verses that were covered in the last session. So in Jude 1:1 we read, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to those who are called, sanctified by God the Father, and preserved in Jesus Christ, mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. For certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men who turn the grace of our God into lewdness and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. And so those three underlying terms there were terms that were covered in the last session, this idea of it being necessary for Jude to change the direction of his writing, because he had seen that what Peter had talked about, what Peter had prophesied as coming in the future, had come upon the church. So he was under constraint. It was necessary for him to change the course of his intended writing, and exhorting us to contend earnestly for the faith. We looked at that significantly in the last session on what that means, to fight to win, and what that looks like in real life as we're called to contend for the faith, not only in our churches, but in our daily lives as we live our faith before the world. Why? Because the scriptures tell us that certain men crept in. And you'll remember that I liken this to a parasitic, a viral infection that slips into the church, and over the course of time, it begins to do damage and undermine the superstructure of the church. So that's just a brief review. So let's go on here and launch right into Jude 1 and the first half of the verse. It says, but I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, and we'll stop right there. And so this is on behalf of Jude, a timely reminder of that which they have already been taught and come to know. So the information that he is conveying to his readers here is not something that they're hearing for the first time, but they've heard this before. And this speaks to the blessing of repetition. And so we repeat things, and teachers repeat things, and that's how we learn, and that's how these things become impressed in our mind. But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord. And so here we have now two passages side by side. And so I'm going to read the 2 Peter passage first, and then we'll move over to the right side of the slide, and I'll read you the corresponding Jude passage. In 2 Peter we read, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who would afterward live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who walk according to the flesh, in the lust of uncleanness and despise authority." So that's the 2 Peter passage. There is one comment I want to make there. In that reference to Lot, it said that he tormented his righteous soul, or that he tormented his own soul. And I believe that that was self-inflicted, because he continued to dwell in that place where all of that ungodliness was surrounding him. And so there's a lesson in there for us, and there's a lesson that's talked about, that's further amplified in the New Testament, about separating ourselves from those things that are against the clear teaching of Scripture, and the potential effect on us if we fail to heed that exhortation and that admonition. All right, now moving over to the corresponding Jude passage in verses 5 to 8, we read, "But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Likewise, also these dreamers defile the flesh, reject authority, and speak evil of dignitaries." All right, so let's take a quick look at these 3 examples here that are laid out for us in the text. The first one is obviously a reference to the Exodus account of the Old Testament. And there's the verse again, "But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe." And so when we think about this, that the number of people who actually came out during the Exodus was well over 1 million. And yet we also know that not many of them entered the promised land. And so they violated the boundaries of faith. And so what I mean by this is that we are called to live lives of faith. And it was no different for the Jewish slaves who had been delivered out of the slavery of Egypt by many signs and wonders and by many powerful deeds. And yet we see that they violated the boundaries of faith, and it was always manifested at times of hardship and trial. That is when faith is really put to the test. You see, we think that faith is never tested when things are going well, when the road in front of us is nice and smooth, but our faith is tested during difficult times when patience is necessary. And so we see this here, that their faith, in many cases, was a superficial faith, or at best a weak faith. And when they came under hardship, they quickly rebelled against their leadership, and they forgot, that God could do great things for them, and that he had been doing great things for them all along. And so that's the first example. The next example here we move on is to what I call the Genesis 6 defilement. Okay, so moving on here in the text in verse 6 we read, "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." So some key words there that I want to unpack a little bit. And the first one there is that word domain, which actually means a sphere of influence and authority, divinely imposed limits. And so we know that angelic beings are what I've come to call transdimensional entities. That is, that they are able to move between the spiritual realm and the temporal realm under the direction of the guidance of God, and that they also have the ability to influence temporal matters as well. And this passage that comes to mind comes out of Daniel chapter 10, and where we have the account of Daniel praying and asking when was God going to deliver Jerusalem. We see that in Daniel chapter 9. And then we read the response that God sends to him in Daniel chapter 10. We read, and let me find the passage here. In Daniel chapter 10, starting at verse 10, we read, "Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees in the palms of my hands. He said to me, 'O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you.' While he was speaking his words to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, 'Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words.'" And this is the verse that I want to emphasize here. "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia." And so there's the reference in the first part of verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And so it appears quite clearly in Scripture that these transdimensional beings that we know as angels are able to move between the eternal realm or the eternal sphere and the temporal sphere, but they are evidently given strict limitations as to what kind of influence they can exercise in the temporal realm. We're told in the book of Hebrews to always treat strangers kindly, because in doing so, some have entertained angels unawares. And so they have their domain of influence. Well, this group here, they transgressed. They went beyond the limits. They left their proper domain and their proper abode, what they were able to do, what they were permitted to do in their interactions with the temporal realm. Well, it tells us about these beings that they have been reserved, or they have been detained to keep and to hold fast. So as a result of this transgression, where they exceeded the bounds of their permissible interaction in the temporal realm and with human beings, they have been confined. Okay, well, now here is where we digress a little bit, and we'll look at this passage in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 and following, which talk about this transgression here. So in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, we read, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So here is now where I want to introduce some of these apocryphal writings. There are two here, actually there are three. There are three that are referenced in, actually two referenced in the book of Jude. One is called the Assumption of Moses. The other one is this book of Enoch. But there's a second one here that I'm going to reference in a minute. Not because these writings are inerrant and inspired, because they're not. But there are certain truth statements within them that obviously Jude identified and he brings forth. And what these writings tell us is they tell us what the mindset of the culture of the authors who put these writings together. All right, so some background information on the book of Enoch. This comes from sacredtext.com. So the book of Enoch, written during the 2nd century BCE, or BC, is one of the most important non-canonical apocryphal works, and probably had a huge influence on early Christian, particularly Gnostic texts and beliefs. Filled with hallucinatory visions of heaven and hell, angels and devils, Enoch introduced concepts such as fallen angels, the appearance of a Messiah, resurrection, a final judgment, and a heavenly kingdom on earth. Interspersed with this material are quasi-scientific digressions on calendrical systems, geography, cosmology, astronomy, and meteorology. All right, so this is an ancient writing. It's been around a long time, and if my memory serves me correct, I also believe a copy of this was also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, so let's look at this parallel account now. So what we're going to look at now is the parallel account to Genesis 6 as it's given and expanded upon in the book of Enoch. So we read in the book of Enoch chapters 6 and 7, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read the parts that I think are germane to, to our discussion here. Okay, in the book of Enoch, chapter 6, verse 1, and it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not. Indeed, agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, We let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swore they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And then what follows there are the names of 19 leaders. And if you combine that 19 plus the one there, Semjaza, that makes 20. And the bottom statements there, these are their chiefs of tens. So each one was chief of 10 of these angels, and so the total number of them was 200. Okay, now dropping into chapter 7, we read, And all the others took together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms, and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant. And they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisition of men. And when the men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Okay, so according to the book of Enoch, chapter 7, they began to multiply, and they began to consume all of the produce and all of the the goods that humanity was producing. And when that could no longer sustain them, then they began to actually devour mankind, and we'd see that later on they actually turned to cannibalism. But there's that statement there that they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. I think we're going to get at least some insight into what Jewish authorities thought that might be referencing as we jump forward into the book of Jasher, another apocryphal writing. Now, we know that a book of Jasher is referenced in Joshua. I believe it's either chapter 10 or chapter 13. But no one actually thinks that the various copies and the various variant readings of the book of Jasher that we have available to us are that original one. But I want to speak to the specific one that I'm going to quote from here today. And this gives a little background information on that one. And so this says, this is one of the apocryphal books of Jasher. There are several, as many as 5, separate works by this title, all composed much later than biblical times. This particular one is a translation of a Hebrew book printed in 1613. And that's really what I want to key in is that the verses that I'm going to read to you coming in the next slide were actually written down in 1613. And so it gives us a good mindset as to what at least the Jewish thinking might have been in reference to what we see written in Genesis chapter 6 and in the book of Enoch as to these giants beginning to sin against birds and fish and the animal kingdom, so to speak. And so this text, dropping down the bottom, covers much of the same ground as the traditional Mosaic books of the Bible, from the creation of the world to the death of Moses, albeit with several minor variations. Okay, so the book of Jasher, chapter 4. And bear with me as I read down through this. And Lamech was 180 years old when he took Ashmua, the daughter of Elisha, the son of Enoch his uncle, and she conceived. And at that time the sons of men sowed the ground, and a little food was produced. Yet the sons of men did not turn from their evil ways, and they trespassed and rebelled against God. And the wife of Lamech conceived and bare him a son at that time, at the revolution of the year. And Methuselah called his name Noah, saying, the earth was in his days at rest and free from corruption. And Lamech his father called his name Menachem, saying, this one shall comfort us in our works and miserable toil in the earth, which God had cursed. And the child grew up and was weaned, and he went in the ways of his father Methuselah, perfect and upright with God. And all the sons of men departed from the ways of the Lord in those days as they multiplied upon the face of the earth with sons and daughters. So here now we're getting into the parallel account, a parallel rendering of what was recorded in the Genesis chapter 6 passage, as well as the Enoch apocryphal writing chapter 6 and 7. All right, reading on in verse 17. Or verse 16, and all the sons of men departed from the ways of the Lord in those days as they multiplied upon the face of the earth with sons and daughters. And they taught one another their evil practices, and they continued sinning against the Lord. And every man made unto himself a god, and they robbed and plundered every man his neighbor as well as his relative. And they corrupted the earth, and the earth was filled with violence. And their judges and their rulers went to the daughters of men and took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. And the sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air. You see the connection here to the Enoch passage? And taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. And so this is astounding here, because here we have an account that was penned in the 1600s that actually talks about trans-species manipulation of mixing of one species with another. And so that's astounding. And God saw the whole earth, and it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon earth, all men and all animals. And the Lord said, I will blot out man that I created from the face of the earth, yet from man to the birds of the air, together with cattle and beasts that are in the field, for I repent that I made them. And so there was it parallels the account of Enoch, and it parallels the account of Genesis, that all flesh had corrupted its way before the Lord. Not just humanity, but what happened was a corruption on a global scale of not only humanity, but evidently the animal kingdom as well. And all men who walked in the ways of the Lord died in those days, before the Lord brought this evil upon men which he had declared. For this was from the Lord, that they should not see the evil which the Lord spoke concerning the sons of men. And Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord chose him and his children to raise up seed from them upon the face of the earth, the whole earth. So it's apparent here that not only the human gene pool, at least this is the way I understand this as I've studied it throughout the years, is that the entire gene pool, as a result of this, of these angelic beings transgressing the boundaries and cohabitating with human women, producing this monstrous offspring and introducing all of this wickedness into the earth environment. That finally the entire gene pool, not only of humanity, but apparently much of the animal kingdom, was corrupted as well, save one line, the line of Noah. It says there that Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord. And I absolutely believe that that means that God providentially preserved the gene pool of Noah clear of any of this intermixture of seed. All right, but that is a debated subject. And so the question here is this reference, and you'll notice there back in the Jasher reference that it called them rulers. And so here we are. We have at least two possibilities here. Were these angels, or were these human rulers? And I think the key to answering this question comes from looking at the underlying term and how it's used in various places in Scripture. And so in Genesis 6:2, if you'll remember, the term that was applied to these angels were the sons of God. That's the term. And it's used in 3 other places in the Old Testament, all in the book of Job. We read in Job chapter 1, verse 6, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Job 2:1, Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the final passage, which really gives us the time element here, in Job chapter 38, verses 4-7, we read, Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? This is now God questioning Job. Tell me if you have understanding. So the time frame here is when God laid the foundations of the earth. Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And so that phrase there, the sons of God were shouting for joy when God was laying the foundations of the world. So to me, it seems pretty clear that this cannot be speaking about human rulers. But really, the key to answering this question, is it angels or human rulers, is in looking at the offspring that were produced as a result of this copulation between angels and human women. Go back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, and let's break some of those terms down. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So the first term that I have underlined there is the term giants. In the Hebrew, that term is Nephilim, which means bully, tyrant, or giant. The root word implies something or someone fallen. And so this is an offspring that is fallen or has come from fallen entities. In the Greek Septuagint of this same verse, the word there is gigantes, from which we get the English word giant. The second phrase that I have underlined there is the phrase mighty men, and the Hebrew word there is gabor, or mighty and valiant men. So they were brave, they were warriors. And finally, the third phrase that I have there underlined is men of renown. That is, they were men with a name, or they were legendary. Okay, so that's the offspring of this union. Some other Old Testament usages now. So now we have the word Nephilim that's also used in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. This is the context of this passage is when the spies had returned from spying out the land on the other side of the Jordan. This is their report, or part of their report when they came back. There we saw the giants. The Hebrew word there is Nephilim. The descendants of Enoch came from the giants, the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight, out of numbers. But there are some other terms there that are in the English are translated as giant, but the underlying Hebrew word is different. The next one we encounter is this word Rephaim, and synonymous terms are listed there. Emim and Zazumim all are referring to the same specific group of giants. In Deuteronomy 2:11, they were also regarded as giants, Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites call them Emim. And so here, giants, the Rephaim, are equated to the descendants of Anak, who are Nephilim. And so we see the names are used interchangeably here. And so that word Rephaim comes from a root meaning energetic and vigorous. So they were strong, they were powerful, they were fast, so on and so forth. And those are other passages there where the term Rephaim is used to describe the descendants of Anak, or those who came down from the giants, from the Nephilim. All right, so now pulling all the pieces together here in this digression, the offspring were physically huge. They were intellectually astute. They were formidable warriors, and they were tyrannical and utterly corrupt. So the only logical conclusion here was that the sons of God of Genesis 6 were angels who left their permissible sphere of interaction with the human race and brought a corruption of the human gene pool, with the exception of one line. And if those other comments tying Enoch and the book of Jasher to the passage in Genesis 6, that there was genetic manipulation taking place in the animal kingdom as well. So they were involved in that, if that's correct. But there was one line that was preserved from this corruption, and I believe that that's clearly stated in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. All right. So we've covered two. Now, there are, when you survey history, so this is kind of like a Pandora's box when you begin to look at this concept of giants. But the reality is it's a ubiquitous thing in every culture of the world. There are historical reports of giants, and even in our land, they're known as the mound builders in the United States, the Hopewell and Adena cultures, and those mounds were they were excavating them in the 17 and 1800s, and they were unearthing skeletons of huge proportions, and with odd anatomical features, and you find this not only in this culture, but you find it historical reports all over the world of these giants who lived at one time. And there was a local stonemason in Shelburne Falls, Mass, by the name of Jim Vieira, who started examining the stone structures of these mound builders, and found them to be complex and intricate. And as he started digging into the background and the archaeology that had taken place over the last couple of hundred years, he started to find some interesting things in reference to these giants that were being unearthed in this country and in various parts of the world. And he actually did a short 25-minute presentation on what he found, concerning these things. It was given in the TEDx forum, and I will post a link in the description portion of this video. I encourage you to watch it. It's pretty illuminating. It's pretty interesting. But so here we are. So there are all kinds of records, and so here is one that was discovered in the 1800s, and eventually the remains of this Native American were purchased by the Smithsonian Institute. It is reported for $500, and hasn't been seen again since. This is the cover of a book on my shelf. Obviously, these two men they look pretty big to me. And then finally, there is this fossilized Irish giant at 12 feet 2 inches tall. And notice there that his coffin is propped against a railroad car. This is also out of Steve Quayle's book. Are these genuine, or are they a hoax? I really don't know, but there's a lot of historical attestation to the genuineness of these things. And so there is our digression, and hopefully you will, if you're interested in this, you'll pursue it further on your own. Which brings us now to the third example that's given in the book of Jude. Sodom and Gomorrah. We read in Jude 7, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So here now Jude's focus is on fornication, or prohibited sexual relationships. And so the term there is strange flesh, transgressing the permissible boundaries of interaction at a species level. And I thought about this for a while, and actually what is represented in this text is actually the reverse of Genesis chapter 6. Remember that those three men that came to Sodom, I believe two of them were angels who came to Sodom, and so you had men calling out to Lot to send out these angels so that they could engage in homosexual relations with them. And so we have the transgressing, not only at the interspecies level, right? So the scriptures are very clear on what it says about homosexual relationships, but we also have a transgression taking place at the interspecies or transspecies level. And so we have this brought before us to consider as we try and build a character profile of the grace changers. All right, so let's put this all together and bring this session to a conclusion. The grace changers are men who have crept in like a virus. Verse 8 says, likewise also these dreamers, in the like manner of those three examples we have before us, they defile the flesh, reject authority, and speak evil of dignitaries. So the defiling of the flesh speaks of prohibited interaction. The rejecting of authority speaks to refusing to act within the permissible bounds that are established by God in His Word. And speaking evil of dignitaries refers to dismissive of spiritual entities and realities and authorities of structures. All three of these manifestations of rebellion were exemplified in the Old Testament examples listed in those verses above. And so Jude is driving us to the place where we will understand and keep this in our minds, that these will be manifested in one way or another in the character of the grace changers, those who would infiltrate the church. And so we're getting there. We're beginning to finalize a character profile on these grace changers. Okay, so in our next session, we'll move on to part 2, and we'll complete this character profile of the grace changers and put this all together and move on from there. With that said, God bless and have